Brothers and sisters, I would ask you to turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 4. We'll be reading from the verses 15 through 24. So starting from verse 15. Take careful heed to yourselves, for you saw no form when the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the midst of the fire, lest you act corruptly and make for yourselves a carved image in the form of any figure, the likeness of male or female, the likeness of any animal that is on the earth, or the likeness of any winged bird that flies in the air, the likeness of anything that creeps on the ground, or the likeness of any fish that is in the water beneath the earth. And take heed lest you lift your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the host of heaven, you feel driven to worship them and serve them, which the Lord your God has given to all peoples under the whole heaven as a heritage. But the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be his people, an inheritance as you are this day. Furthermore, the Lord was angry with me for your sakes, and swore that I would not cross over the Jordan, and that I would not enter the good land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. But I must die in this land. I must not cross over the Jordan, but you shall cross over and possess that good land. Take heed to yourselves, lest you forget the covenant of the Lord your God, which he made with you, and make for yourselves a carved image in the form of anything which the Lord your God has forbidden you. For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. Thus the reading of our most holy God. Let us now stand and sing in preparation to hear the word preached to us from Psalter number 461. Let us sing all the stanzas. For our text this afternoon, let us turn to Exodus chapter 20, where we shall read verses 4 through 6. So starting from verse 4. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. Brothers and sisters, this afternoon the sermon that I will be reading was prepared by Reverend Andrew Kaminga of the Escondido United Reformed Church in California. Dear congregation of our Lord Jesus Christ, it has been 40 years since God gave those instructions to Israel, and Moses is giving his last instructions to Israel as they are ready to enter the promised land, and that is where we find ourselves in Deuteronomy chapter 4. They have been wandering because of their sin for 40 years. Moses is about ready to go to heaven. It is time for Moses to give some last-minute instructions to God's people. In Deuteronomy 4, we find some amazing words, powerful words, 7 important words. They are important, children, because God comes with his commands for our good. When God comes to us with his commands, they are much like the rules or the commands that our parents give to us when, for example, they say, don't play with matches. Now, when they tell us not to play with matches, it is not that they don't want you to have them, but it is because they do not want you to get hurt. That is why they say that. It is for the same reason that God comes to us and says not to mess around with his worship, because you're going to get hurt. That is why it is so important that we pay so close attention to this word of God that comes to us, particularly about the worship of God, because to mess around with worship is to mess around with fire, and worship that is not according to God's will and according to God's word, God will indeed reject, and ultimately God's punishment will fall on those who insist on worshiping him in any other ways than he has commanded in his word. It is an important subject for us today because, as you know, every church, every denomination, everybody is experimenting somehow or other with worship. Seeker services, contemporary services, traditional services, take your pick. What do you want? Guitars and Hawaiian shirts, or rock bands, praise teams, or pipe organs? Do you prefer to sing out of books or off the wall? Do you want skits, or do you want biblical-based preaching? Do you prefer psalms or choruses? Coke and crackers or bread and wine? Take your pick. You cannot be a Christian today without somehow or other being confronted with the question of worship, and I would suggest that every one of us has at least one time said that I wish we would do this or that in our church like our neighbors do or like my friends do in their church. It is an important question. This whole question about the second command and the question about worship, it is important to us, but before we begin to make those suggestions and before we begin to try to apply what we think might be good ideas for our worship, let us remember that God has a few ideas on his own because worship is important to him too. We cannot separate worship from God because worship and God go together. When we talk about worship, we are talking about God, and in that context, we must remember that God is a consuming fire. You say, boy, it seems to me I heard that someplace before, and you did. It was in Deuteronomy 4 that we read today where God described himself in connection with the second commandment as a consuming fire, verse 24. You might say to yourself that it is the way it was in the Old Testament, that is the way that God described himself in those kinds of judgmental, fearful descriptions, but of course, God also describes himself in the New Testament with those very same descriptions. In Hebrews 12, we find the very same words written there. God is a consuming fire, and it is interesting in Hebrews 12, when we read that also in connection with worship, that God says, I am a consuming fire. Let me just read that text for you a moment. Hebrews 12, verse 29. Let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably and with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. Not just a fire, but a consuming fire, a fire that destroys. That is the idea. God is saying that we may not play around with worship because he is a holy God and he will consume those who do. That is what God says. That is perfectly evident. That person, that church, that nation that perverts worship will suffer the consequences. That is not my idea. That is what God tells us in his word. That is hard stuff, isn't it? We don't buy that kind of description of God today. Over and over again, someone will say to us, my God isn't like that. I don't have that fire-breathing God of the Old Testament. My God is the God of the New Testament. My God is the God of love and grace and peace and joy. And of course, that may very well be, but then your God is an idol because he is not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is a God of grace, love, mercy, and loving kindness, but he is also the God of Sodom and Gomorrah, the God of the flood, the God that destroyed Israel or false worship. You see, brothers and sisters, if you want to worship God, if you want to know God, then you have to read both the Old New Testament and the New Testament. You have to read both Revelation, where it speaks about all the bowels of wrath that are poured out, and you may also read the Gospel of John. But you must read it all, because all of it is God's revelation of himself. We are to worship then, says the Lord God, only in the way that he has ordered it, that he has prescribed it, and to do anything else is to risk the consuming fire of God's wrath. One cannot help but think of some in the Old Testament that didn't listen to that message. We think about the sons of Aaron. Maybe you want to read that when you go home. The story of the sons of Aaron is found in Leviticus 10. They were sons who were consumed by God's wrath for false worship, sons that Aaron would not lament over because they had disobeyed God. Read Leviticus 10, verses 1 through 3. Do you recognize anything there? Our God is a consuming fire, particularly when it comes to false worship. Do you see why we must be careful when it comes to worship? It is not something that we simply mess around with indiscriminately, because God is very jealous about how we worship him. The commandment itself reminds us of how important it is. You shall not make for yourself a graven image. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation of those that hate me, but showing loving kindness unto thousands of them that love me. Those are hard words, aren't they? As a matter of fact, we have heard hard time in understanding that. I have spoken about that many times before, but our memory is short, so just let me remind you once again. When we read about God being a jealous God, our children probably ask how that is possible, because jealousy is a sin. And of course, jealousy on our part is sin, because we are jealous of people. We are jealous when someone gets a new bike, or we might be jealous when someone gets a raise. We are jealous when someone gets an A because we want that. We are jealous of people, and therefore it is sin, because we do not rejoice with them but are jealous of them. But God is not jealous of us. How could God be jealous of us? God has all things. God, what could he possibly lack? What could we have that God would want? So God is not jealous of us, but God is jealous for us. God's love is not just a moderate kind of love, an uncompassionate kind of love. It is a burning love. Therefore, he is jealous for his people like a mother is jealous for her children, because she wants the very best for them. So God is jealous for his children. He wants the very best for them, and that especially happens in worship, because worship is fellowship with him, and he doesn't want that fellowship disturbed in any way. Sometimes the Bible speaks about God's relationship with his church as a husband's relationship to his bride. And there is no husband that will allow his bride to dishonor herself by sleeping around. There is no husband that would allow the bond of love to be disrupted and broken in that way. Neither will God. His love is too deep for that. He is jealous for the honor and for the respect and for the holiness of his bride, the church. Maybe we react a little negatively to that word, jealous, but isn't it a wonderful word when you think about it? That God is not simply a force, but God is a person who loves us with that kind of zeal, that kind of zealousness. God loves us with a love that is so great that he not only spoke about love for us, but he came to die for his bride to make her holy. That is how great God's love is for the church, and that he dies for his bride to make her holy, and he will not then allow her to become unholy by the way that she worships. And he adds a warning to that, saying that he will punish the sins of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. We react against that too. Does God punish me for my father's sins? And while it may at first reading seem to be that way, as you come to understand this passage and you come to understand the whole Old Testament, you begin to realize that God does not punish children for their father's sins. Ezekiel 18 is very clear about that. But a father's sin is often passed on to the child. And the father who is an abuser of children begets abusive children. We know that only too well today. An alcoholic father often begets alcoholic children. An unbelieving father or a false-worshiping father begets unbelieving, false-worshiping children. Then when you begin to understand why it is so important that we as parents worship God properly so that our children will not follow our example of sin and disgrace and unbelief. Why it is so important for not only my life but my children's life that I make sure that I am in a right relationship to God. For if I am not in that right relationship to God, I will pass that on to my children, and they also will suffer the same kind of judgment of God, because they also worship the way I had worshipped. Who but God knows the long-term tragic consequences of false worship on the church, on children, and on children's children? You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I am the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands of them who keep my commandments. It is that very same thing that we rejoice in as God's people who worship him in a covenant family of God, that we also recognize that God blesses the parents and the children's children of those who are faithful in worship. It is for that reason, of course, that we dare to bring our children forward in the covenant community to receive the New Testament circumcision, the baptism, because God is a covenant God, blessing thousands of those who keeps his commandments. So you begin to see, brothers and sisters, what a tremendously important subject the subject of worship is and the second commandment. Let's look for a few moments at its divine prescriptions, and we can only begin with that because we are going to continue it next week. What is prohibited is obvious in the Bible, that God prohibits worship by the way of imagery. I mean to say, you cannot read the commandment without recognizing that obviously that is number one in God's mind here, that we are not to use images in his worship. When Moses begins to explain that commandment, he begins in a very detailed fashion. He begins to list all the idols that you may not take or make. You may not make them of humans, of animals, of creeping things, of birds that fly, or fish that swim in the ocean, of sun or moon or stars. On and on he goes to detail exactly what God means when he says no images. There is nothing in heaven above or in all that creative order that we may make in order to worship God. Then you wonder, how in the world could people not understand what God is saying here? But the human mind is so perverse that it indeed can twist and pervert exactly what God forbids. How could the church, for example, in the early centuries allow images and relics and icons and religious artifacts to come into the church? Isn't this commandment clear? Of course. This commandment is very clear, but they weren't brought into the church to worship, but they were just brought into the church to help in worship. They were like pictures to point somehow to God. There is nothing new about that. In the Old Testament, when Jeroboam began unauthorized worship in an unauthorized place with unauthorized priests in an unauthorized ways, he made 2 little golden calves, one in Dan and one in Bethel. No, Jeroboam didn't think that those calves were God. He had just made them. He wasn't stupid. Idolaters today don't believe that the image they have made is God. But Jeroboam said that was the way that they would worship God. This would be a reminder of God. This would help them to visualize somehow and lift our eyes to God. The Jehovah God of Israel, the one who brought us out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of bondage. But the unauthorized way of worship was the first step, the first tragic step that led ultimately to the destruction of Israel. It is because they followed after false gods, which began here with step number 1, that God finally destroyed the entire nation. The same tragedy occurred in the early church when they brought in images, icons, relics, pictures, and statues of the saints. As I said, when these things were brought into the church, the idea is not that the church would worship them, but these were pictures for those who could not read. They were pictures that were worth 1,000 words, so to speak. And what a smart thing to do, to have these pictures all around the church and to have the bones and the relics of the saints all around the church to remind them about courage, sacrifice, and all of these things. What could be wrong with that? We are not worshiping them, but it has destroyed the worship. It separated them from God, because now when the Bible began to be read and when the homily was given, people could sleep. But when the icons, relics, statues, the bones of the saints, and the religious objects were brought into the church, then everybody woke up and they wanted to touch and to kiss and to revere. The word of the living God to them was no longer being heard. They no longer were worshiping him, but them. And in messing with worship, God came and rent the church apart. You see, it is very obvious that God does not want to be worshipped in any other way than that he has commanded in his word. So often we only talk about the negative in terms of God's divine prescriptions. But I also want just briefly to say what is permitted. And now you think that I am going to give you lots of examples of what we may or may not do. No, I am not going to talk about that. What I'm going to say about what is permitted and what we sometimes forget is that while it is not strange that God will not have us make images to worship him, what is wonderfully strange is that God invites us to worship. That is the wonderful thing, brothers and sisters, that God invites me as a sinner to worship him. that I, as God's child, may come and worship him before whom the angels tremble. That is an awesome thought. That is what God permits. God permits me to worship him, to be in fellowship with him, to speak to him, to sing praises to him, to acknowledge him as my God and as of my Father. I can run to him to know him, that I may know his grace and his mercy and his loving kindness. I may sing his praises with a tin ear, and with stammering speech I may pray to him. What a wonderful thing that the second commandment not only forbids idolatry, but it encourages me to live the living God and to worship the living God. I hope that doesn't escape our notice. God, in that sense, is so much like a dear parent. A parent will take a pathetic picture that his child has scribbled and will put it on the refrigerator and honor that pathetic piece of art. And God does not the same thing with me as a sinner. As I come to him in the name of Christ, my pathetic worship, my stuttering, all of that business God puts on the refrigerator, he accepts it as praise from his child. What a feeble effort God is pleased with. That is what is permitted in our worship. What is central in worship? The Word. And the Word is central in worship. God has prescribed in his Word what we are to do in worship. We are to see to it that we do all that he commands us. We may not add to it or take away from it. No images but the Word. In the Word, God images himself. God tells us not to make images of him. I will make my own image, he says. I will describe to you how I am, what I am, who I am, he says, and I will do that in this Word. And ultimately, this Word brings us to Jesus Christ, who is the image of the invisible God. Ultimately, the Bible brings us to Jesus, who is the very image of the invisible God. Philip says to Jesus, "Show us the Father." Jesus said to Philip, "He that has seen me hath seen the Father." Again, Jesus said, "No man can come unto the Father but by me." The Word brings us to Jesus, through whom alone we may come to the Father in worship. There is no approaching God apart from Jesus Christ. Not the finest worship, not the most sacrificial gift will be accepted before God without Jesus Christ, brothers and sisters. That is what all of the Old Testament was pointing to. You could not worship God without the sprinkling of blood. Blood everywhere was blood around the temple, because God was pointing to the one who would come, who would be the Lamb of God and take away the sin of this world. It is only when we come in the name of Jesus that we can worship God. Then someone will say, "I can buy that," not the God of the Old Testament of consuming fire, who rains judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah, who sends the flood, who destroys the Amalekites, the Moabites, the Hittites, and the Philistines. Not that God. I can worship Jesus of the New Testament, but once again you are on dangerous ground, because Jesus of the New Testament is the God of the Old Testament as well, and God does not change. Jesus in the New Testament is the God of the Old Testament, the God of justice. There is only one God that we may worship, and the entire Bible is needed to know that one God. That is why God gave us this book. It is his speech to us. Do you want to know what God is like? This is the God you are worshiping. This is what I am like. This is how I am. This is what I am. This is what I am to you. This is how you may approach me. And this is God's image of himself. I am the God who delivered Israel out of Egypt, but I am also the God who smote Pharaoh. I am the God who dwells in life inaccessible, but I am also the God who dwells with him who is of humble heart. I am the God of judgment, but I am the God of Bethlehem as well. You see, brothers and sisters in Christ, the Bible is God's revelation of himself. It is his speech to us. It is through the Bible that he communicates himself to us. God speaks through the prophets. He says that this is what I am. I am a God of holiness. I am a God of awe. I am a God of majesty, of might, and so on. It is that God that we are to worship, the God who images himself in the Word of God. It is through the preaching of the Word and the reading of the Word that we meet God. We do not meet him any other place. We meet him here. Here, God opens his heart to us, and here God has met him in the Word. Now that creates some real problems. Too bad God didn't know about the problems we would face today. We face a culture that is word illiterate. We can't communicate with Generation X today with the Word. They are television kids. They need something more tangible. They need something more visual. They need something more sensual. We have to re-image God today for them. We need to have things that they can touch and see. We have to find better ways to illustrate and to describe. In patriarchal days, it was all right to describe God in masculine terms, but we need other terms today. We need inclusive language. We need politically correct language and all of that stuff. It is too bad that God didn't know about pictures and artists and movies too. Bad Jesus didn't come today when we could take pictures of him. Too bad Jesus didn't come today when we could take pictures of him and show him on television throughout the world. But of course, God did not know about today. We don't have to reimagine God. When we do that, we make an idol of him. God has imaged himself, and he does it in his word. It is in the preaching and the reading of the word that God uses as a vehicle that we may experience him and meet him and worship him, so that he will not have to say to us that he will visit the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, but instead that he can say to us in worshiping me in this way, I will show loving kindness unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. Amen. Let us pray.